Okay, so it's 6:01 and I'm going to go ahead and get us started because I'm very excited to hear this conversation and listen to the questions and answers from our two great speakers. So I'd like to introduce you to two of our wonderful local university, USF's architecture professors. We have joining us Robert MacLeod, who's professor and director of the University of South Florida's School of Architecture and Community Design. And we also have joining us today, Josue Robles Carvalho, who is a faculty and research associate with USF's School of Architecture and Community Design. And they're here tonight to have a conversation with us on the occasion of our 10th anniversary about the power of architecture and its ability to form and support communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing speakers and let them do what they do best.
Talk endlessly. That's what we're paid to do. Thank you very much, Kim. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to be a part of the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the building. Not of the institution, as you say, but of the building itself, and a special building it is. Josue and I spent quite a long time this afternoon talking about talking tonight. And we probably spent longer talking then than we will now, because we tend to talk a lot when we get together. So I see a few familiar faces in the audience already, and that's really neat. So, you know, we decided not to show any images tonight. We thought we would really just have a conversation. And I think we're going to talk about places that might be familiar to a lot of people. Some of you perhaps have visited these places and you will know of them. And if you don't, it might be a fun thing to go learn more about them. I think we want to start off with one thing that Josue and I talked about is what is necessary for community, the idea of community in architecture. And I think public space is one of them, right? The idea that there's some kind of communal space we all can be a part of. And Josue, what do you think about that? I mean, what other things begin to give rise to public space and the sense of community that we look for in our communities?
Necessity. There was something when we were discussing what would be important for us to communicate today, which was like I had to second what Bob said, that it was indeed a great conversation, but it sort of it raised a lot of questions, and a lot of them were addressing the value of the buildings themselves and what they mean, but that they do change over time, and that they behave in particular to also the local geographies, but also the time that they're operating.
You know, if we talk, can you hear me okay, Kim? You said to turn up my volume.
Yeah, if you could just turn it up a little bit more.
Okay, I don't have any volume to turn up, actually. So I can speak louder, or I could just...
That's good right there. That's perfect.
Is that better? Okay, maybe being closer is better. So, you know, one thing we talked about earlier, Josue, is the idea of the Agora. We go back to the Greeks, right? That's kind of how most architecture students and architects are introduced to the idea of public space and the idea of community. And there's a lot of things the Greeks got right, and that's why we continually look at them. And in the Agora, you had so many different forms of public space, right? You had a place for teaching, you had a place for the market, and the market really becomes the essence of the Agora in a lot of ways. But there was also theater, there was entertainment, there was governance, and anything you can imagine that began to define the public realm at that time period. And the Agora is something we kind of see again and again reinvented over time, sometimes still very public, other times privatized. And that is a theme, is one of the things I think will begin to bind the way we're thinking a little bit about community, is a place that can sponsor a lot of events happening simultaneously. One thing Josue and I talked about was how cities and buildings within cities change over time. And, you know, a quote I really like is, it goes something like, "When history ends, memory begins." And this is from Peter Eisenman's, the academic Peter Eisenman's introduction to Aldo Rossi's Architecture of the City. It's kind of a seminal book for architects and urbanists. And the idea that buildings change over time, continually change over time. The form of the building may be there, but its kind of function changes, right? And that's something that we see very often in cities.
Yeah, it's we all have seen how buildings find a second life, or sometimes a third or a fourth, and serving a given purpose, very elegant, very sort of sometimes smooth, and also I want to use the word trendy, and this is because of a local reference that I would make. So it feels, if anything, armature works now. It just to point a local point of reference of a building that served with given merit, served its purpose at one point, and now it has found a different one, serves a different type of program. But apart from serving what it is now as this sort of very specialized, very interesting food venue, it's also a local icon. And what it's really interesting is that although we might not use it, although we might not frequent it as much as we want to, or maybe we're not interested, it's still a part of our community, and it's still a part of the sort of communal pride that we feel for the building. So this is something that when we talked about the notion of time and the value of a building, addresses that not only how it serves, but also how the community feels for the building. And we felt that that was important to sort of mention it, because this also refers to the Dalí Museum.
No, go ahead, Josue.
We not necessarily, because we visit it every day, means that we're not, it doesn't feel like it's part of what we love of our community. And I think that that's something that we felt that it was important to sort of mention, because they're completely correlated.
Yeah, you know, you think about how buildings age over time, right? And, you know, it doesn't have to be a millennia. I mean, something as simple as the Armature Works is a curious building because it's been there for a good while, sat empty for a long time, was used sparingly for many years. And then it's been kind of reinvented, but it's the same basic building. And we can see that over time as buildings are kind of static things, and they're what we might call monuments. They have a monumental present, not like the Washington Monument kind of monumental, but they have a permanence, the kind of root word. If we look at the root of the idea of monument, they have a permanence, and things around them may change. Well, they're kind of static, and in some ways they retard and then in turn generate the growth of the city over time. And the Armature Works is a perfect case. If you go down there now, you can see all kinds of residential condominiums, I guess, apartments and whatnot that have propped up around it. It becomes a destination. It's one of the things that kind of charges the river walk and the water taxi and these other infrastructural pieces. And all those participate in the making of community and the generation of public space through this one building. And whether we actually go in the building or not, to be around it has a certain kind of really positive energy, I think.
And in the same conversation, before we talked about the museum, and how does it become a part of other activities or events that do happen? And in preparation for today, we started, I particularly started to look for images of the Dalí Museum, and then noticed that for the Grand Prix, it's more notorious for the Dalí, or at least more present. The buildingness is present in a lot of the imagery for the race.
Yeah.
So it's not about just having this fantastic group of individuals race in our backyard. It's to do it around these icons of value. And I was surprised that, so the scale of, like, something about the scale of the building, that it does change how the level of influence, but are they important? Yeah, so there buildings of all sizes are important in different ways, and also based on the purpose. And yeah, I was sort of surprised to see that. I thought that most of the images and the tags when I went into Instagram would be the Grand Prix by the Bay, but a lot of them sort of felt that it was more photogenic to have the museum as a sort of a graphic component of association, but it's also pride.
Yeah. The interesting thing is Josue and I have gone to the race for several years in a row, except of course this past year. And we spend, you spend a certain amount of time in the bleachers watching the cars and all that, but we also spend a bit of time in this fantastic public room between the Dalí and the Mahaffey. And there's a kind of dynamic about that, and there's pockets of people gathering in different parts of it. And as a public space, it works very well with an event, especially an event that large, because there's many, many thousands of people. And it can accommodate that. It's kind of the lung for the event in some ways, because it's kind of, people are kind of moving back and forth between various buildings, and the kind of carnival row that's set up, the midway that's set up as part of the race experience.
And I tell my students that good buildings are forgettable and great buildings are memorable. And the presence at the scale of a building in this magnitude definitely lends itself for us as users to make those memories, to sort of create these anecdotes that we build upon as time goes by. And that's when you know that a building is successful, or a park, or a public space, or a school. It's not necessarily by how you think it look, how trendy could be, from what style or school of thought would be, but our capacity to engage with it and build memories, personally, and with those that we love. And I think that the building is greatly successful for it. Everyone's a fan of Dalí, even if you don't agree. You have to sort of love the work, if not the artist. But yeah, like the previous museum, which I felt that it was great and in a terrific location. Yeah, it does not engage the community, and it doesn't have the scale of in the capacity to host different type of uses, which it was something that we felt it was important. That yeah, you could be a great building and be completely introverted, but the way in which the new building has the capacity to accommodate not to just a given type of use, but to many, it's great for community empowerment, because it allows to serve many groups at different times and for different reasons, which is sort of the opposite of gentrification, which we have been sort of, which we're not going to talk about anymore. We didn't plan to talk about it, so we're not going to talk about that. But I think that that's really great. There was something that we talked about this sort of.
Well, let me pick up on what you said about the spectacle that occurs. again, I'll mention Aldo Rossi again. He talks about the theater of the city, right? The spectacle of the city as people live out their lives in public. And we all like to go to public spaces and public arenas where we can kind of take in people, right? And the theatrical nature of the urban realm, I think, is really important. I mean, and something like that race is high drama, right? But it doesn't have to be something as exceptional, as extraordinary as that. You know, the old Dalí, of course, has found a second life as a building for the university. And it's being transformed, and it'll probably be continuously transformed as programs change within it over time. And now, where before you had this kind of artwork displayed, now you have students in graphic design and graphic arts and other majors working in those same spaces. So it's a very humble example of that, you know. It's not like Palladio's Basilica in Vicenza or something like this, but it shows that it's still a kind of relevant analogy to talk about how buildings have a kind of permanent static quality. And the old Dalí is a very humble building. It's just a kind of dumb butler building. It's a metal building, but it has this transformational quality that I think is really kind of very interesting, you know.
And it has this adaptability that it's crucial, and that's why it's able to find these other lives, as we have mentioned. So something that we felt that it was important to also mention was that the Dalí it's not acting by itself. It's in a neighborhood of very great participants along the waterfront. We have seen how the pier, it's a new phenomenon, let's say. But what it's really interesting is that while we have seen how other cities and other areas, they are not as rich, although they're new in development, they don't have a strong system of public spaces as the waterfront has.
Yeah.
But what we felt crucial that we bring up is that it's particularly great because it's not pay to play. And the notion of publicness that the network of spaces have, it's quite empowering.
Yeah, we tend to call this, right, maybe an authentic public realm. I mean, there's a publicness to going to the mall, right? And kids like to cruise the mall and hang out and stuff like that. But it's privatized public space, right? It has its own set of rules that are apart from the sort of rules that a town or a city or community might have. There's rules to occupy it. You can't go in there and just bring your megaphone and start talking or wear a placard and start ranting. You'll be removed very quickly. So the privatized public space is a kind of substitute for a public space. But I think what's important with what you're saying, Josue, is the authenticity of public space that can be occupied, you know, kind of without demands to participate in any economic exchange and things like that. Although, going back to the Agora, the marketplace is a very viable thing.
And yes, and we love to sit at the cafes, and we love also this pay to play, let's say, places in which you have to consume. And that's fantastic. We're not saying that that's wrong by any means. I just want to make that.
I mean, a cup of coffee is a pretty cheap price for admission.
Yeah. So, and that I agree to pay. No, but I think what it's interesting is that we might not want to be in the mood to go to the beach or to go into the water, let's say, every day. But we might want to be a part of the landscape without having to get in the water. And I feel that this series of urban rooms that occur along the waterfront do allow you the capacity to be a part of it, even in a casual way, or like Bob said, to have a megaphone. It's not exclusive to Capitol that you can do that. You can also do it locally.
Well, you've brought us to something else we want to talk about. Let's talk about how buildings shape space, and how the occupying of space vis-a-vis how buildings work together is important. Now, you all know the Winston Churchill quote, something about we build our buildings and we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us, or something like that. I butchered this timeless quote, but the idea that we build something and it kind of builds us is really very relevant. I think the quality of things we make and how we occupy them has everything to do with the kind of the way that they impact us. Sorry, phone call. And I think that that's a kind of critical thing to consider. What makes a good space? So, Josue, what do you think are? I mean, what's a kind of great public space that you think of when you think of great public spaces?
So, for example, we spoke about Bryan Park in New York. We also that we might not know exactly what are the buildings that sort of shape the space or
Other
frame
than the New
the
York
space.
Public Library, it's a series of good, fairly banal, but I mean that in a kind of nice way. Not every building in a city can scream up and down and jump, right? You have to have these background buildings. You're right. I mean, it frames Bryant Park, and it's not about the buildings, although the backdrop of the public library
It helps.
is handsome. It's a piece of stage set in a way.
But what it does is it's allowed for this space that it's services the density in a very sort of pleasing way. So I guess when it's really hot, that's when the ice cream is best, right? So that's so that's why this green space within this density becomes of value.
Yeah.
And that's why and it becomes a symbol. And that's something that it keeps resonating when we're having this discussion, is that these buildings, they do serve a purpose, but they become symbols of pride. Or sometimes they have a darker association to them. But in this case, it sort of becomes mutually owned by everyone. It's not owned by anyone. It's a symbol to all. And that's something that it was important for us to sort of communicate that. Yes, we also talked about Siena, about very particular geography and the campo in Siena. And yeah, it's very difficult to replicate.
Two very different, right? I mean, they couldn't be more different. One is a hard space, one is a green space. One has a kind of almost twisty oblong character with not such tall buildings, 6-story buildings, maybe 7. And then in New York, the interesting thing about Bryant Park to me is that it has all these layers, right? And it's a matter of inches, and then it's a matter of many, many feet. But you have rows of trees, you have some gravel where you can sit in chairs and have a drink. You have the street, and then the sidewalks on both sides, and then the buildings that provide your kind of frame. But you have a kind of patch of green in the middle, which is a big deal in a city as dense as New York, as you say. And it can also sponsor a lot of events. It's very transformable as a public space. And I think Fashion Week or something like that uses that all the time. And I'm sure there's plenty of other events that are kind of more formally staged there. So it's a very fluid and flexible space as well. We get a little feedback there. So, and then Siena, Siena is a huge space, and even when it's empty, it's okay. There's something about Siena that just feels right. And of course, you all know they have the famous horse race in Siena that they hold as a kind of major event of the city each year. So it's that kind of flexibility in a public space. What do you think then? So we talk about shaping it, and this is when you were saying earlier, in good public spaces, the buildings have the potential to be very secondary, and they don't need to make much noise. They just have to form the fabric of the city, right? And then the theater of the city can take place between them. As I told you earlier, one space, the kind of public space I like is actually the space of the street in cities. The kind of linear movement, of people, of activities. And there, it's a much more intimate experience where you have shops, individual shops. You have people selling things spread out on a blanket. You have characters, you have crazies, you have musicians. And the idea that the street becomes a public space is, I think, really important to me. That's the one thing that I think makes towns and cities and communities special, is when they have these kind of streets. And it doesn't have to be big urbanism by any means. They can be very humble streets, but they have the ability to become a place that you can occupy with your body without being in an automobile. I think abandoning the automobile is really critical for the kind of experience we're talking about.
And I think, to add to Bob's comment, when we love the street as this sort of continuous experience, and we tend to gravitate to lots of activity. And let's face it, not everyone you see going down the sidewalk is going to do the same thing that you're going to be doing. So we have to acknowledge that in this sort of common space, it's inhabited by a lot of people doing different things. And that lends to something that we mentioned, is the capacity for different users to use a space for different means. And if we can go back to Bryan Park for a minute, when something as simple as the seating for the park was being sort of planned or designed, the sort of the Bryan Park chairs came about, which is just simple chairs. And the reason they're very successful, it's not because each chair it's going to win any design awards. It's mainly because if you want to be by yourself, the space and the type of seating and the build form allows you to be by yourself. But if you want to be with 20 people, you can pull 20 chairs and make a circle and go at it. So, and then from brown bagging, you have this sort of informal drum circle that takes place. And that we go back to that memorability once again. So yes, there is at one level, we're talking about the building allowing or creating creating the space in which the theater would take place, the play would take place. But also that a lot of people doing different things would use it. And that's what creates the atmosphere that we love, is this sort of multiplicity of things happening at once.
Let's talk for a minute about institutions. It's one of the reasons we're here tonight. And maybe the kind of extreme case is what we call the Bilbao Effect. Some of you will know when the Bilbao Museum was built in Spain several years ago, it kind of led the way with a lot of extraordinary buildings plopped into both well-known and obscure cities, and it became known as the Bilbao Effect because it generated commerce, it put places on the map, it generated kind of secondary and tertiary industries in support of the institution. And what are your thoughts on that? Because I didn't have a desire. I didn't even know Bilbao existed before that museum was built. And now I've honestly not been, but, and I've been to Spain a couple of times, but I've not been to Bilbao, but I still think it would be worth the trip. What's your take on this kind of institutional place building? And we saw the same thing with performing arts centers in a lot of communities too, not so long ago, where they were going to become an economic engine, and the arts are in fact a big economic engine in the United States and elsewhere throughout the world, really.
Apart from being a cultural generator.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had the opportunity to visit Bilbao twice, and unfortunately none before. So I just like Bob, as a student of architecture, I went to the place to see this building that everyone loved and spoke about. And at one level, the building activates a great part of the city. And it rebrands what the museum is, and not necessarily just as a collector of precious artifacts, let's say, but it becomes a means of expression as well. And it sort of allows the building to initiate a conversation way before you step into one of the galleries. And depoliticizes what art could be, or art is, because now, as we mentioned, now the building is part of the landscape and is sharing a cup of coffee on every given, lunch break, if permissible, right? So it sort of starts to give the building a separate life, a museum particularly. And it opens up the collection. It opens it to the whole landscape. So it's not only about an incredible, beautiful, and interesting building. It's what it's really powerful of this movement. It's that, that it becomes a part of everyday conversation in a provocative way.
Well, it's a curious case because it really redefined that city, and it was quite the alien landing in the historic fabric of the city. Created some powerful moments within the city that are kind of unforgettable when one sees them recorded and presented, essays about the building and so on.
And it's fair to say, not without criticism, all buildings, something that we mentioned about earlier, and I want to make a note about Armature Works. Of course, we have lots of not so pleasant criticism, but just like Bilbao, it was highly criticized because of the conflictive graphic vocabulary or design vocabulary to the context. But over time, it was, I don't want to say it grew into people, or it was there, we couldn't get rid of it, right? But that's part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And we all have that cousin that, man, we sure love him, although we don't understand his life decisions. And I think this kind of work the same way. It's like, how is this thing put together? It's phenomenal. It's a work of art. Yeah, indeed. It's a museum. Yeah. And it also have great work inside.
And it certainly challenges conventions of how to present artwork. It's parts of it anyway are pretty challenging in building. So, and it also began the kind of franchising of art, the franchising of the Guggenheim and things like that, where institutions were not necessarily precious things within their city, but now they could be exported. And I wonder, that's a tricky thing that I imagine a lot of those of us, or not me, but those who are involved in the museum world more directly, like Kim and her colleagues. I think that's an interesting condition where, is it like getting a Target in your town and you don't have one? But generally, I think when cities have ownership, so to speak, of institutions, and they're very particular to their place, like the Met. Okay, we all know the Met. The steps of the Met are one of the great urban moments in New York City. Everyone who's been to the Met has probably plopped down on the steps either before or after they go in, or even just to hang out there. And that's a kind of, very particular and special urban place, just like the New York Public Library. And I think that, when institutions grow over time, change, additions are made to them. I think they have multiple lives as well, how they engage the community over time. And I think one of the things we can talk about is the programming of public space, which ties in a little bit to the programming of museums and other such places. We talked a little bit this afternoon about the idea of the event and the fact that certain things can be very spontaneous about cities in the public realm and communities, but many are, in the best sense of the word, kind of premeditated. And that's when kind of civic leadership steps into play. And, there are events that become integral to the city. Naturally, the race that we spoke about earlier, the IndyCar race, is huge in terms of an event that's transformative in the city and then gone. And I think, those kind of instant things are pretty interesting in the way public space can morph for an event and then go away.
For example, one of another perfect example of this is that in Bogota, Sunday mornings, they have a condition is called the ciclovia, which they close a highway for 5 hours, 5 or 6 hours, and it's only open to pedestrians. So now all of a sudden, we're using the space in a way that we would have never had the capacity to walk on a highway or to roller skate or to bike down the highway because programming. But at one point I was like, how interesting can this be to just walk down on a highway?
And then when you told me about this, I thought it was fabulous that a highway becomes a public space for pedestrians and bicycles.
And the fact that you slow down the appreciation of the space and the experience, now it's home to Sunday markets, it's home for plays, so now there are kids playing football or soccer in the middle of the highway because in a dense area, they don't have that big of a space. So it's once again, it just by programming the space and allowing this gap and saying, okay, so cars need to take a break. And these other conditions that are very interesting that, yeah, they were not designed for, but given the opportunity, they could turn in very interesting and beautiful, unexpected now events. And it was really interesting from seeing a flower booth, all kinds of food, anything, but also in these bike shops now along the highway that basically after a few hours, it shuts down and it disappears and it's business as usual. So that talks about how transformative space could be used with clever programming and allow particular events to take place.
That's really interesting because that's one sort of infrastructural public space community building thing that's you can kind of turn off on and off like a light switch, right? And the other extreme is, say, in Seoul several years ago, the mayor at the time, who I think went on to become the president of Korea, I'm not sure if that's correct, but he spearheaded a project to basically dig up a former river that ran through the city and had been paved over many years ago. And here this river was recovered, unearthed, and constructed into a public space, a long linear space, and it was incredibly popular. And now this is a permanent part of the city that deals with kind of both infrastructure that was transformed and then transformed back. And I think that's a kind of incredible example. And the other obvious one in the U.S. is the Artery Project in Boston that was completed many years ago when you all know the highway that sliced through Boston and separated it into different districts was put underground and took a long time and a lot of money. It's a kind of an extreme infrastructure project, but it's such a difference when you visit the city now because you now have a kind of green river of landscape moving through the city where before you had a big elevated highway.
And I think what Bob is talking about, sometimes it's a bit unscripted and a little bit of and there's a ton of risk taking when programming for these events. But they sure can be really impactful. And now when we sort of circle back to the Dalí and now what we know it does offer, but now we're even more excited about what it could in the future, right? And I think that that's something that we wanted to talk about, that there's a lot of uncertainty with what's happening everywhere. But no, I think with a lot of optimism, we have to say this, we're lucky and it's a privilege to live where we live and to have buildings like this in our community. Now I'm just, I'm really happy to see what can happen next.
The next stage and next, I think, has happened with the pier opening after all these years. And again, in St. Pete, and 10 years apart almost, you have two major pieces of civic infrastructure, let's say, civic buildings, institutional buildings, and so to speak. And they operate differently. One is necessarily more internal because it's its duty. The other is a more kind of expansive external experience about the water and the sky and so on. But they serve as really interesting kind of an interesting pair of buildings to think about the water and to think about St. Pete and so on. And I think completing the pier was like the museum itself, a really important project, not just in St. Pete, but and not just regionally.
State.
These are really important projects throughout the state and beyond. I mean, those have both been looked at internationally and will continue to be. And I think those are the kinds of things that I would hope contribute to civic pride and for people wanting to live here and all those sorts of things. But I find those two intriguing buildings that have been built in just a short time I've been here, moving here in 2009.
Needless to say, the MFA is also a fantastic neighbor to have.
Yeah, well, it is, and I love that it's placed in the park. I think it's kind of it's a very Florida building in a way, not necessarily in the way that the pier is a Florida building. I mean, it's a transparent building that's porous, air can move through it, but it embedded in the park. And since the park is so important, the linear green is so important to St. Pete. I think the museum is this kind of special anchor. And I think we also give a shout out to the banyan trees as well. We all love. So we're at about 6:45, Kim. Should we take a break and solicit some questions? Because we could probably talk till 7:30 or 8. So.
Yeah, so I'm going to just recommend to everybody so that we wouldn't have a lot of feedback and a lot of crosstalk. I muted everybody. If you would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and press down your space bar, and that will allow you to unmute temporarily while you ask your question. And then you let go of your space bar, and then you'll be muted again so that we can hear the answer. Okay, does that sound good to everybody? Well, if no one else has a question, I do. I was really interested as I was sitting there listening to you talk about buildings that have gone through different uses and how they take on new lives. And I was wondering if you could give me an example of a building that one of you or both of you see as having been impacted by what was done in that building before. That is, somehow the traces of whatever that building was used for have impacted now the new use of that building.
Yeah, well, one, interestingly enough, we were talking about this afternoon, is one of my favorite buildings in northern Italy, in Vicenza. It's a basilica, and it's always attributed to Palladio. But actually, the building existed before Palladio, had gone through various iterations and functions. And I think its origins was as an ecclesiastical gathering building space, some sort of a church or chapel. And it's a kind of oblong, twisty building. And when you look at the plan, there's an internal plan and an external plan. And Palladio regularized it and made the kind of classical orders of the day and turned it into kind of a perfect building. But as you walk through it, because it's very porous, it has some enclosed areas and some passageways. You can see the kind of original shape of the building and the torquing of the building and so on. It's kind of fantastic building to go through. And it sits in the corner of the major piazza in Vicenza. And it negotiates a section shift, so you have to go downstairs either on the edge of the building or at the back of the building. And now it houses a huge exhibit hall that any number of exhibits, international exhibits, visit the community. And it has everything from a clock shop to a place to buy flowers in it. So it's got a little floor of commerce. And then at least there used to be some municipal offices and things like that in it. But it's always been the anchor of the city in many ways, I think, the city. And it was even bombed during the Second World War and reconstructed thereafter. So it's a building that's gone through all kinds of transformations, and it is a very potent building. And it's the backdrop for everything that takes place in this extraordinary, it's a kind of a long, thin piazza, anything from markets to gatherings to political events and festivals.
And another great building that it's worth mentioning is the Tate Modern in London. Talking about finding a very different second life. It went from being in a neighborhood that it was known for meat packing to now being one of those most important museums in the UK and in Europe, we must say. But I think while some buildings have to be reshaped to accommodate the new life, in this case, the protection of its integrity was a symbol of what it meant and sort of showcasing the beauty that it could, that it had. And that it, because of the size of the building, it presented a ton of challenges to what a museum is, which is a series of galleries or spaces.
It was important to mention it was a power plant.
Yeah, but it was, yeah. And so what the nature of how equipment was moved or whatnot, it became an inspiration to like how the circulation was gonna took place now. And something that we mentioned before, the scale. I think it's also very, to some extent, even shocking. And I think that while the collection is great, I think to preserve these sort of moments in which will allow you to witness the scale of what it was, is sort of, it's allows you to maintain this sort of continuity to maybe what people felt when the building was originally used.
And yeah, because the generator halls, the turbine halls are huge.
Mm-hmm.
If you were designing a museum, you would never propose a space that big. You'd be laughed out of the room. So the circumstances, right, were such that it has this absolutely heroic space that they maintained. They didn't fill it, which was, like you say, a brave
Mm-hmm.
call. And I should imagine it's had a huge impact on the immediate area around it, right? I mean, I don't know offhand how transformational it's been, but I imagine it's had a huge impact on what goes on in the neighborhoods.
I have a question. Now that we live in a pandemic era, here in St. Petersburg, there's been some transformation of activities and services outdoors. You see some parking spaces now being used for dinner tables outside of restaurants. We see yoga class on the pier. But it seems to me that we have that much more available to us where we could move things outdoors. And I'm wondering if you see this transformation continuing and becoming greater, or is this it and we're just all going to wait for the vaccine? Because it really seems to me there's so much that we could take advantage of right now.
Gosh, that's a great question. And I think, I mean, first of all, yes, I think we can and should. I mean, I think the worst thing that could happen is that everything returns to normal after say in the fall when the vaccine is widespread, there's greater safety, a feeling of greater safety. I think it would be a shame if we didn't learn some important lessons from this experience. It's a conversation. I mean, of course, you're talking about public space in your comment, but I'll just say it's a conversation we're starting to have in how we are going to build the school in the future. I mean, are we going to go back to normal? I think not. We're fortunate, right? I mean, we can sit outside in November and December and January. Clearly, a lot of the world can't. And that's maybe another conversation, but most of the year we can sit outside and be pretty comfortable. I mean, even in July, if you have some shade and a fan and a little bit of water being spritzed at you, it's not bad. So in a way, it's timely that something like the pier comes online and we see this kind of wonderful porous building where air and view and light can move through it so fluidly. And I think that I don't know that the pandemic is going to force us to rethink how we design buildings 3 years from now from the ground up. Like, I don't think we're preparing for the next pandemic. Although my daughter said to me this evening or this afternoon, what if years from now, having a cold is like having COVID is like a cold and you just have it and get rid of it. And so we don't know what we're going to have to live with is the point. I thought it was kind of an interesting comment. And I don't know, Josue, I hope we continue to take it like, I hope we make less decisions driven by the automobile.
Yeah, and I think the institutional, I think in public spaces, I think like what we saw watching the race, games at the pier, and they sort of created this system for folks to use the space and still tailgate and watch that. So I think that adaptability, it's quite easy, and I think that we have seen how it's implemented and welcome. Like Bob said, I think there's some lessons that we did learn. Like, for example, we talked about that we should value now social engagement, and I don't think that we would take it for granted now, because we have acknowledged that we are not meant to be by ourselves in whatever. So it even makes us question the notion about safety. This is keeping me safe to what level? But now we even talked about, like in the classroom, can we have these presentations outside? Can we have, can the building be more flexible? So there is no, we are not constrained to being inside or out. Can the spaces offer more flexibility to allow us to sort of curve this notion? And I think it's possible. We have seen institutions, to mention in Bogota, when we went with a group of students to visit their campus, and the building was able to adapt to the weather. If it's freezing, then it would shut completely. But then he had a system, the building was pliable enough, just like as we are. And I think that that's a good question that the pandemic is forcing us to ask. And of course, there's costs associated with this, and who's going to maintain it and all that good stuff that we're not going to talk about. But no, I think the question is it's here, and I think that is definitely one of the ups of the downside. That if it wasn't because of the pandemic, we would not be considering them. So hopefully some changes occur. I don't think there's going to be formal by code, the city making us shape our buildings in a particular way, but I think conceptually we are all thinking about it.
Yeah, what's interesting is how different work might be. What percentage of the workforce will continue by choice to work from home, therefore making excessive office space unnecessary, and what is that office space going to become? What is it going to become? What is it going to transform into? And it will become something else. And those are the easiest buildings to change. I mean, it's just nothing but flat floor space if you're talking about an office building. So it's an interesting thing to kind of imagine the world of, a decade from now and how much differently you're going to work. Like, we've been online teaching for almost a year. And I have to say, we were nervous when we went online last March. And it went better than I could have ever imagined, which is a tribute to the faculty and the staff and the students of the school. But now we've been almost a year online and we're good at it, but I don't know that we all love it. I mean, the students kind of would like to see one another and hang out a little bit,
Which is part of education. And I think we cannot only gauge the success of the program, or let's say of a class, just by grades. I think something great that our school had to offer, and a lot of schools, or most schools, is the capacity to students to socially create bonds. These are what they're going to be the colleagues later on. These sort of casual engagement that happen at the studios. It's not necessarily happening now.
Talk about community and a loss of community.
And that is what the notion of community. And that's what the sort of space giving you the capacity to pull a chair and say, let's talk about X or Y. So that's the value of the space. And that while, production, it was fantastic and we were impressed. But the sort of unknown factor of this constant exchange and casual exchange, it's taken off the equation. So we don't know about that. But I think it to some extent, even as a faculty member, I miss being a part of this sort of community of, sharing with students and colleagues. Like a presential, it's while it's we have seen how successful and resilient our kids are. I personally say I do miss being at the office. I never thought I would say that, but I think we have to be reminded of what we have, and I think the pandemic has done so. So hopefully we're happier when we find some sort of normalcy, if that's a state.
I don't know if this is a question or more like a comment or a mix of all together, but it's I think it's the idea of I wonder, do we as architects that we start designing, how far in the future should we look for designing? I mean, obviously we have the experience of what's going on right now and how in the past similar situations kind of like affected architecture and how that became rules to things that we do now. But how far in the future should we now design for? And talking about the idea of buildings potentially be flexible to change in the future, should we design with the idea in mind that this building could potentially end up being a complete different thing? Is that something fair to say as we start to engage again to this idea of like, okay, we need to design now? It's almost like starting over in a way.
First of all, is this the Jose Gonzalez?
Of course.
I'm pretty sure it is. I don't know.
My graduate assistant for 2 or 3 years. I don't know. Josue, you take this, first of all.
You know that we sometimes when we're on campus, not USF, of course, you see a sign, do not step on the grass. I think the sign will be reversed in the future and say, please step on the grass. And I'll say this as a way of, maybe a conference room, it's not going to be this sort of executive alike sort of setting. And now we're looking into a completely open space that we are not going to be, it's ventilating a different sort of space or whatnot, that it does allow us the capacity to meet, but psychologically, it engages us differently. One of the first buildings that I worked after I graduated was a school in Haiti. And we realized that buildings that were more than 2 stories were not welcome because folks has seen a lot of people that they loved die in the earthquake. And it did not matter how safe our buildings were. Their association with what they had lived, that building, that 3rd story was never going to get used. So the capacity to produce a safe building and a stable building was not in line with how the people felt. And I think COVID has sort of shaped how we see publicness and coming together. So we do acknowledge it as important, but now we're going to be a bit more cautious in how we congregate. And I do think that we are going to be asked as designers to design a bit different, to provide for spaces that allow us to feel a notion of comfort, but let's say if you're a business, even a notion of productivity.
Yeah, I think Jose's question is an interesting one.
It's great.
But I would also say, Jose, how long we build something to last is one thing. And we can talk about that a lot of different ways, but I think where we build it is also more critical than ever. Building on coastlines has been problematic for a long time, is more problematic than ever now. And how we're going to build kind of more resilient and sustainable communities and the buildings as part of those communities, I think is really kind of critical. And I think that's the big challenge for you more than me. I mean, you're the one going to be out there building, and we have several students in the audience, which is nice, including Matthew Dahl, another blast from the past. And that's good to see you, Matthew. And I think, I think building responsibly is what's critical. And, some buildings are designed almost by amortization tables. I mean, they're not designed to live a long life as the original plan of the building. But that doesn't mean it's not a good building. It can transform over time. Others have kind of the institutional firepower and horsepower behind them. And we would hope that things built on our campus are going to last a very long time. Things like the Dalí is going to be around for a very long time. And it's built to last. I mean, it's built to handle a Cat 5 or something like that. I mean, I know that's where I'm going from the Cat 5 hits. But seriously, I think that it's an interesting question because it seems like a simple question, but it's a really complex question because there's a lot of pieces to that recipe.
And I don't think we're going to no one's going to have to ask us to think about it. I think now it's ingrained into who we are. So inevitably, when the lead touches the paper, we're going to be thinking about it in how to engage spaces for a post-pandemic sort of situation. So I think it's going to be, I envision a more intuitive sort of way of approaching it. I don't think it is going to have to be forced.
Just to add really quick to that, and I do agree with that in essence, like currently I'm working on a project where our main question is, how do we build an apartment for people to work in the apartment? No longer the idea of like, oh, people are going to just go there and watch TV, sleep and leave. Now they are also adding this extra layer and how to make it different or special enough.
Yeah, I mean, and the workforce we think the workforce is going to shift, right? I mean, it'll be fascinating to watch that happen. I mean, I'm going back to my office, but, at least 3 days a week. But it's I mean, do we have a faculty meeting online, or do we all gather in a room in the fall or the following spring? I mean, I think we're questioning some of those things.
Good.
Oh, this is Arthur. You said you'd like to see the design less centered around the automobile. Can you expand on that and what would it look like? Well, first of all, the big parking garage that's over there by the museum, you know, the huge one, the best moment in that parking garage is during the race when all the race teams have their big 18-wheeler rigs in it and it becomes a mechanic shop. It's like fantastic, right? It's like, I love it. And, you know, it's a kind of event. I mean, that's where we hang out before the race. It's neat. You know, a lot of the, well, first of all, it's an interesting question because I think, and this is something, again, Josue and I were talking about this afternoon, urbanism, you know, America has been kind of an anti-urban place for a long time. I mean, the founding fathers, the philosophers, Thoreau, Emerson, Thomas Jefferson, they love the agrarian community. I mean, we're very much founded in that sensibility. I think Jefferson was a real urbane guy and kind of tolerated. He was willing to tolerate the city. And consequently, you know, when technology in the 20th century hit, we were happy to get cars and drive places, and we still are. And it's led to our suburbs, which are very beautiful in many cases, but it's also made a kind of sprawly development, which is not a very sustainable way to work. And I live in a suburb. I mean, you know, guilty as charged. But I lived as close to the university as I could be because I didn't want to drive long distances. And when I lived in Gainesville, I rode my bike to work for years and years because I wanted to be near the university and not have to deal with parking more than anything, quite frankly. So I think that a lot of it is you build dense and you need different forms of transportation. So St. Pete is building a ton of buildings now, and they're probably pretty pricey. To buy a 3-bedroom condo downtown is probably very expensive. But let's just say, you know, the money you spend to live closer to downtown maybe is discounted by the fact you don't have to commute. I mean, the funny thing is when the pandemic hit, I had a tank of gas in my car, and it like lasted 3 months. I mean, I drove nowhere for months, and we were kind of laughing about it. And before that, we were driving everywhere. We're taking the kids here, we're taking the kids there, and now we were living, you know, this kind of monastic existence like everyone else with our little pod. So I think when you have denser situations and the ability to move in other ways, be it mass transportation, which has never been a big hit in the United States except for the big cities, and it's an increasingly difficult thing to squeeze in, but there are ways to do it. And there's a way. It's so expensive to build all the infrastructure when you have flexible, when you don't need the infrastructure and you just have smart buses that can weave around, and you need maybe a couple of dedicated lanes rush hour, you know, it can kind of happen. So, you know, the less you, and I like the automobile a little bit because it makes things cluttered and it slows things down a little bit. You know, I like the automobile to have to stop a lot when it's going through places and defer to people crossing the street and things like that. I mean, I'm a big St. Pete fan, I have to say. And I like visiting St. Pete. I'm not there often enough, but I like, you know, walking around. Some of the streets are a little wide. I think they're a little too wide, but nonetheless, it's a really fabulous city. And I just think density is the key for a place. And it doesn't have to be New York City density. You know, 3-4 stories is fine. I mean, that's the kind of density that I think people, I mean, if you go to California, if you go to like, you know, Venice Beach and those areas, they're dense, but they're 2-story dense, 3-story dense. And yet they're kind of cluttered. And I think that's interesting. I mean, Pinellas County is dense, it's filled, but it's 2-story dense, 3-story dense. I mean, there's not a lot of open space in Pinellas County. And someone immediately could tell me I'm wrong, but I think that the spirit of the comment is that it's kind of low rise, could be a little bit taller, in my opinion, certain areas. But St. Pete is not, for the most part, you know, 20-story dense. It has tall buildings now. But I think, I don't know, I've said dense too many times, but I think you have the ability for people to live and work in fairly close proximity. I mean, my theory has always been you probably have a pretty small radius, unless you're commuting a far distance from where you live you know, I mean, I've always had this really small radius. I may go out here from time to time, but you can kind of live very well in a fairly tight circle.
And you know, we could tie it to something that we mentioned before, and it's about flexibility or creating opportunities for things to occur. The car doesn't allow you that. It's pretty allows us to experience the space at very high speed, and it sort of deprives from that sort of casual opportunity that sharing a space would grant us. And you know, moving forward, I think we have to also add to this conversation, like we are going to collective own a car because of self-driving cars. Hopefully, we can capitalize on technology, and let's say you know, Bob, Kim, and I own a car, but then we don't have to show up with other 10 people, and then we can schedule it when we use it, or it comes and picks us up, and then it picks up Bob up. And so basically there's no, you know, like now where we have a parking lot next to the museum, we could have that parking lot can find a second New Life being another type of housing project or something like that. And I think that that's something that we have to consider. Not the use of car. I think we have to acknowledge that we have created an infrastructure that it might not change, because there's so much invested into it. But ownership of a car.
That's a real neat point. I mean, your car is empty and stationary 90% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Costing you $300 or $400 a month, more gas, insurance, whatever. And now my two cars are combined 30 years old, so I haven't had a car payment in a long time. But you know, I should probably get a new car soon. But the interesting thing is that, you know, what would make you give up your car? Well, if you could go anywhere you wanted to, whenever you wanted to, without owning a car, would you do that? And how long is it going to be where you can get your phone, punch in a few numbers, and a car will pull up and take you the 10 miles you need to do, like that, and then take you back the 10 miles when you're done? I mean, I got to believe we're not that far away. And
No, we're not.
Whether it's Uber and someone's driving you, you can do it now. Probably too expensive for most people to do all the time, but if you were to, it would be an interesting thing to figure out. I mean, figure out how much money it would take people to give up their car. What creates convenience. And you know, like, I like to drive. I don't mind driving. I like to drive fast. One of my cars will not do that. The other one can, but I never get to drive that one. And I think that, you know, these kind of transformations, I think we're on the cusp. I think Uber is an interesting thing because it imagines you living without a car. Because they'll be there in 6 minutes, and you can watch them come to you on a screen. Right?
Yeah, and I think to have a different parallel. I know we're over time. It's our parents loved the big house, the 4-bedroom home, the 3-bedroom home, because it was generational what they wanted. We have seen a polar shift. And our students do not want that at all. And this is just one generation. It's a polar shift. Yeah. So I think that we could say that also they are not going to want this sort of, they cherish other things. And I don't think the car ownership will be one of them. We few semesters back, we visited a few universities, particularly in Texas, and they have moved the car at the periphery of the campus, and then you walk wherever you want to or use people movers or whatnot, and the experience is fantastic. And it's Texas hot or Texas cold, by the way. I didn't know it was so cold in Texas. But you know, there's so much more from walking and cycling. That it just transform how we envision buildings, space, and social life. And I think, like Bob said, I think we're about to acknowledge that socially we need to be better integrated throughout. And the car doesn't allow us to do that.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Professors MacLeod and Robles, for spending this time with us. I found absolutely fascinating to hear you discussing all of these things that we often think about in the abstract, but you made them very concrete by bringing them back to the structures where we live and we work and we play. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for those of you that attended tonight.
Thank you, everyone.